And now I'd like to move on to the design stage. And in the design stage, the underlying theme is simplicity. Now, simplicity is important, of course, through all stages, but especially when we're talking about design and talking about visuals. And there are many concepts that you can keep in mind when we're talking about visuals and designing our visuals. I will talk specifically about 7 very useful principles. But before that, I thought it would be interesting to do something a little bit different and talk to you about 3 principles that I got from the world of Zen and the Zen arts that is a little bit different, but you actually can apply these to the world of presentation design as well. The first one is called kanso, which is a Japanese word for simplicity. It's one of the Japanese words for simplicity, which basically means less is more. So think subtraction, not just addition, or look at a design and ask yourself, what could I eliminate here rather than add to it to make it more powerful? The next one is shizen, which basically just means naturalness. And as it applies to visual design, it really is the opposite of slick. We don't want an overly designed or sort of overly slick or artificial. You want designs that are, good looking and very effective, but not sort of forced creativity. The next one is called shibumi. Now, this one's a little bit hard to explain because it has many different meanings depending on the context. But when we're talking about visual design, the idea of shibumi is basically about elegant simplicity or articulate brevity. You can think in terms of suggestion rather than just really, beating someone over the head with it visually. So these ideas really get back to, again, to the idea of simplifying, and that if you simplify, you can actually amplify your message. Amplification through simplification is an idea that people like Scott McCloud has talked about in his book on comics. And the thing is, amplification through simplification is not an idea that is very common with most people. Most people try to avoid simplifying because they think it's going to actually weaken their design. But the thing is, if you keep this in mind, amplification through simplification will actually make your designs much more powerful. So now let's look at 7 design concepts from the world of graphic design that have real applications to our world of slide design. So the first concept is called signal-to-noise ratio, and this is actually borrowed from the more technical fields such as radio communications. So you can think of signal as the message, and the noise, of course, is the clutter, the part that just interferes with that message. On your radio, of course, if you have a low signal-to-noise ratio, the noise, of course, is the static, and that's what gets in the way of the message. In our world, then, the signal are the visual elements that contribute to our message, and the noise is anything that detracts from our message. So noise can include things like footers and logos and decorative elements that really don't add anything, and they act then as noise. Even though we're not conscious of it sometimes, it really gets in the way of our message. So when you look at this slide, what's the first thing that comes to mind? When I look at this, I see lots of noisy elements that just aren't necessary. For example, at the bottom you see a footer. All these things, the date, the title, these really aren't necessary. The logo, not necessary. You can remove that. When you look at boxes, now a lot of default settings sometimes in slideware has boxes around text or around other elements. We don't need these lines around the text or even around the graph itself. When you look at the chart, the axis lines on the chart, vertical and horizontal, you really don't need those. You can either make them very, very thin or remove them altogether, because the bars actually will suggest lines anyway. And speaking of the bars are in 3D also with thick lines, and 3D is not necessary, especially when we're talking about 2D data, right? When you look at the bars, you'll notice that they're in many different colors, right? 6 different colors, 6 different bars. Why is that? There's no reason for that, right? That's just somehow decorative. I would suggest that you make them all one color, except if you wanted to have people look at a particular year. Let's say, for example, 2005 was the year that you wanted to point out. You could make that bar a different color. Now, what about the picture? Now, pictures, I'm actually a big fan of high quality photography in slides, but it's not always necessary. In this case, I think the photo actually detracts. It's just a sort of noise that detracts from this idea of just looking at the data. Data itself is visual. The data itself is graphical. So in this case, I don't think it really adds anything. And speaking of noise, what's the deal with bullet points? Whoever said that you should fill a slide with bullets and that this was an effective visual? Well, the thing is, actually, if most presentation books that you buy will suggest something like the 177 rule or a variation of that. What is the 177 rule? The 177 rule says basically that you should have only one main idea per slide. Well, that's a good idea. I agree with that. Insert only 7 lines of text maximum. Use only 7 words per line maximum. The question is though, does this work? Is this method really good advice? Is this really an appropriate, effective visual? This slide has just 7 bullet points. Now, this slide is actually an example of a slide that would follow conventional wisdom about what is a good, simple slide. But this is not visual at all. This is a great example, actually, of noise, because we cannot read and listen at the same time. In this case, this kind of text on a slide just becomes clutter in my eyes, and it doesn't contribute to the person standing there, it doesn't contribute to the narrative. So the picture superiority effect is quite simple. It simply says that we remember pictures and photographs, for example, better than other forms such as words. And we all know this to be true. In fact, our most dominant sense is actually visual. So let's look at some examples here. All right, so look at this slide. Now, when the speaker presented against this slide, his main point was that blogs are like sharks because you have to keep your blog updated or it will die. People will lose interest. Just like a shark, if a shark doesn't keep moving, the shark will die, right? The thing is, this slide is not very visual. It's not visual at all, and the words are there in bullet points repeating what he's already said. Now, if you look at this slide instead, this slide is very visual and very effective to get the point across. Now, there are no words except blogs are like sharks. And in this sense, the words along with the picture becomes a powerful visual. And they don't get in the way at all of the presenter and his narrative. So his spoken word along with this full bleed photograph and his key point, blogs are like sharks, together make a very, very powerful and memorable message. But also keep this in mind, picture superiority doesn't just mean pictures or photography. It also means things like quantitative displays, bar charts or a line chart. That is also a strong visual element. So when we say picture, we really mean anything which isn't just text or noise on a slide. So the next concept is called empty space, sometimes called negative space, but I love the term empty space. You can see empty space used in graphic design, in layout design, web design, and of course in our world of slide design. The thing is, most people see empty space and want to fill it. And that includes not only in design, but even in their own homes, right? Oh, I have space over here. Let me fill it with more junk. So the thing about empty space is that empty space is not nothing. It's actually a powerful something. And when you leave that area empty, it actually contributes more to those visual elements that are in the positive space. Now, if you look at a lot of the Zen arts, you'll notice that there is balance, but it's not a symmetrical balance usually, it's more asymmetrical. And some people actually say that that's the opposite of balance, but you can also think of it in terms of balance, but asymmetrical balance. So you might have empty space in one area or a lot of empty space which balances out, let's say, deep sort of elements or very powerful elements on a different part of the slide. If you look at this slide here, you'll notice it's rather a traditional kind of slide with a title and bullet points, and there's not much empty space at all, or certainly not a good use of empty space. Now, instead, remember, we don't need the words on the slide, or so many words on the slide, because the presenter is going to be speaking those words. So look at this slide, this first one. You see the text element, hara hachibu, and the visual element on the right, but most of the slide is actually empty. And with these there's actually 3 elements. Most people might see 2 elements. They see the text and they see the visual, but there are actually 3. And the thing is, they work in harmony to provide balance. They don't get in the way of each other. We're sometimes not conscious of this, but these 3 elements work in harmony and work in balance. It's asymmetrical balance, but it works very, very well to support our narrative visually. So the idea of empty space used in visuals is not just limited to the world of Zen, of course. It's something that we use in the Western world as well, in graphic design and other areas of visual design. One thing that I think is really effective is this idea of rule of thirds, which originally sort of came from the golden mean. But the rule of thirds is used by many designers, especially photographers, when they're trying to compose an image. So let's look at some examples here in our world of slide design. So when you look at this slide, you'll notice that I actually put down a grid following the rule of thirds, so it's broken up into thirds. You'll notice that a strong visual element, the person running there, takes up the right third, and even the ground and the mountains take up the bottom third, and then the text element is over there on the upper left third. So it's not by accident, and there's large empty space there that is a really sort of natural space for the text, and it also naturally leads the eye from the right to the left. Here are some more examples of slides that use the rule of thirds to utilize effectively empty space. So I said there were 7 design concepts, and we've looked at the first 3, and now let's look at the last 4. And these 4 I've actually grouped together in what I call the big 4, and they are contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Okay, let's begin with contrast. Now, I think contrast is actually the most important of the 4, and you can achieve contrast in many different ways. For example, black and white, color, size, and shape. But contrast is really about difference and showing difference, and we don't want to just show a little difference, we often want to show a big difference. Okay, let's look at these first set of slides. And the first one here, the blue one, the blue background, you'll notice that the text really doesn't stand out. The text is white, but the background is kind of white, so there's just weak contrast, right? If you look at the next one, you'll see that the text is white and also larger, and the background is very different than white. It's almost black. It's a very, very dark gradient. So that's one. Color was used to achieve contrast, but also size. You'll notice that we wanted to draw attention using contrast, let's say to the word big. So it's much bigger, and also it's bled off the page a little bit, which is sort of interesting, and it's another way to draw attention via contrast. Okay, this example is a little bit different, because if you look at this first slide, you actually can understand the graphic and you can see it, but it takes more work to see it because the background template has a lot of elements that aren't necessary. Again, these are noisy, right? But we could also say this has weak contrast because the background has too much salience. And as you can see, it's hard to see the word rate, for example, in the title, and there's just a lot of noise. It makes it harder to see the text. In the different treatment of the same data, it's just very, very easy. And even though this background does have some patterns on them, they're very, very subtle. So the contrast between the foreground and the background is really good. And of course the text is white, the background is almost black, and it's very, very easy to see. Also, we've used color as a contrast technique because we want people to notice South Korea. That's where we want you to look, and that's where your eye is going to go because it's red and the other bars are gray. So the whole idea behind contrast is that it's a great concept and a great technique that you can use to achieve very powerful and very clear images. It doesn't matter how many you use. You don't have to use many different techniques like big and small, different shapes and so on. But if you use 1 or 2, it can be very powerful and effective. So the second concept is repetition. And repetition is very simple. It just means that you repeat certain design elements throughout your design, in our case throughout the slide deck. Now, the thing is with PowerPoint or Keynote, many elements are already built in. For example, when you choose a template, it will have the same background color, the same kinds of fonts, the same color font, and so on. But that is repetition, but that can get a little boring as well. So we're talking about taking it even a step further. And you might have certain elements that are repeated, not in every slide, but are repeated in just certain slides in a way that fit the theme. For example, in this video, you may have noticed as the concepts have been introduced, there has been one design element that has been repeated. And the reason that we do that is to bring the sections together in a sort of a unified whole. The next design principle is alignment, and the whole idea behind alignment is that nothing should seem accidental or random on your slide. Elements are connected in some way, and that's through alignment. It's best to explain this principle by actually looking at an example. So take a look at these slides here. Now, this is an example of a title slide, and you'll notice usually we centered things, or you might flush to the left. But in this case, we've flushed all the text to the right, and you can see the main title, the subtitle, the name, and then the logo are all lined up on the right, and this forms an invisible line, vertical line, running along the right side. Here's another example, returning to the Harehachibu slide. Now, in this case, the text isn't exactly aligned with the eyes, but it's aligned in such a way that, although again, we're not conscious of it, but the eyes and the text sort of go together. So it sort of flows naturally. The next concept is called proximity, and the idea behind proximity is that elements that are related should be closer together and things which are not related should be further apart. You know, elements that are close together, the audience is going to assume that they're somehow related, and if they're not, then they should be at a greater distance. And again, it's best to explain this with a simple example. So look at this title slide here. You can see 4 text elements plus a logo. And in this case, it's really hard to tell which is more important, right? We see principles of presentation design. The second line is actually a subtitle, and then there's the name and his position. But it's not really clear which is more important than the other. In this example, the second example, it's very, very clear. So the first 2 lines of text are close together because they're more related. It's the title, the main part of the title, and then the subtitle. And then down below is the name. So the name and the gentleman's position, those are together. And the logo, again, is separated because that's the third element. So now we see there's actually 3 elements, not 5 elements. So when I look at this slide, the main problem is I just can't read the text. So how could we improve this? And in this slide, this is the title slide, and here there were 2 things. The first thing is proximity. Before the text was far apart. In this case, it's really come together as 2 text elements. It's the title with the subtitle in close proximity, and then the name, which is very separate, so it's further away. And then the idea of contrast. So now the background behind the text is almost black, which contrasts very well with the white, and then the photograph below eases in, and it's another element which draws us in. So remember, these design concepts are not hard and fast rules. They're simply guides, and not every concept will apply to every slide or every visual. If you want more examples, you can look at my book where I do highlight all of the concepts and others as well. But you know, you can find these examples of these concepts used in graphic design in the world around you. In fact, that's where I get a lot of my inspiration, and where I've learned a lot over the years how to apply the concepts is, for example, driving down the road and looking at billboards, or on the train when I'm on the subway. Every morning I'm looking at graphic design and advertisements, and you really can learn a lot, and you can see how professional designers actually do use many of these concepts in all of their designs as well.